In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American Southwest, where the horizon stretched like an endless promise broken only by jagged mesas and sun-scorched buttes, Elias Thorne clung to life on a scrap of land that seemed more desert than farm. It was the year 1875, a time when the echoes of the Civil War still lingered in the bones of men like him, and the frontier was a place of raw, unyielding struggle. Elias's ranch, if one could call it that, it was little more than a stubborn claim staked against the relentless advance of dust and drought. His cabin squatted low against a hillside, built from salvaged lumber that had weathered too many monsoons, its roof patched with tar paper and hope. Inside, the single room held a rickety table, a cast-iron stove that wheezed like an old man, and a narrow cot where Elias slept alone, his dreams haunted by the ghost of his late wife, Mary, taken by fever 5 years past. He had no children to carry on his name, no kin to share the burden, just the wind for company and the occasional howl of a coyote to remind him he wasn't entirely forsaken. Elias was a man forged in hardship, his frame lean and wiry from years of labor under a sky that offered no mercy. His hands, rough as sandstone, bore the scars of barbed wire and branding irons, and his face, weathered by sun and sorrow, was framed by a beard streaked with premature gray. He rose each day while the stars still pricked the velvet black of night, his boots thudding softly on the packed earth floor as he kindled the fire and boiled water for coffee a week, bitter brew from beans bought on credit at the trading post 20 miles away. Breakfast was simple, a heel of cornbread, perhaps an egg if the scrawny hens had laid one, and a strip of jerked venison saved from last winter's hunt. Then out into the chilpery dawn air, where the sagebrush whispered secrets to the wind, and he set to his chores, mending fences that the tumbleweeds conspired to break, hauling water from the shallow spring that barely trickled anymore, or driving his meager hare to a dozen bony steers and a few milk cows that gave more kicks than Milka across the parched hills in search of sparse graze. Life was a cycle of toil, broken only by the rare visit from a peddler or the distant rumble of a freight train on the horizon, carrying dreams to places Elias could only imagine. This particular morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that painted the canyons in hues of rust and gold, but carried a bite in the air that spoke of winter's approach. Elias had been up since 4, his breath fogging in the dim light as he wrapped the frayed woolen scarf around his neck and stepped out to repair a section of fence along the banks of the Rio Salado. The river was a temperamental beast, narrow and meandering through the red rock labyrinth, its waters usually lazy and muddied, reflecting the overhanging willows like a murky mirror. But overnight, rains from the distant mountains had swollen it, turning the gentle flow into a roiling torrent that gnawed at the banks and uprooted ancient cottonwoods. Elias cursed under his breath as he hammered new post into the soft earth, the mallet's ring echoing off the canyon walls. The wood was green and splintery, ill-suited for the task, but it was what he had. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the cold, and he paused to wipe it away, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of troubly rustlers, perhaps, or the ever-present threat of Apache raids, though the treaties had quieted things somewhat in recent years. It was then that he heard it, a cry, faint at first, carried on the wind like the bleat of a lost lamb, but sharper, more human, laced with desperation. Elias froze, hammer mid-swing, his ears straining against the river's low roar. There it came again, at 2 voices, high-pitched and frantic, overlapping in a plea that twisted his gut. He dropped the tool with a clatter and sprinted along the bank, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. The cries grew louder, guiding him to a bend where the current surged viciously around a cluster of boulders, white foam churning like the sea in a gale. And there, in the midst of it, were the children. 2 small figures, no more than shadows against the raging water, their dark heads bobbing precariously. They were native, that much was clear even from afar, their clothing simple deerskin tunics and leggings, sodden and clinging like second skins. The boy, perhaps 9 or 10, had latched onto a half-submerged branch protruding from the undercut bank, his small fingers white-knuckled around it as the river clawed at him. Beside him, the girl, a year or 2 younger, flailed with all the fury of a wild thing, her arms slicing the air, legs kicking futilely against the pole. Her face was a mask of terror, mouth open in a silent scream as another wave slapped over her. Elias didn't hesitate. Thought was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instinct took over, the same that had kept him alive through blizzards and bandit ambushes. He kicked off his boots, the sharp stones biting into his feet, and plunged into the river without a backward glance. The water hit him like a slap from an icy fist, shocking the breath from his lungs and numbing his limbs instantly. It was deeper than it looked. The current, a living force that wrapped around his legs like serpents, tugging him downstream with relentless power. Elias struck out with strong, measured strokes, his arms cutting through the froth, eyes locked on the boy who was closest. The child saw him coming, his wide eyes locking onto Elias's with a mix of hope and fear. "Hold on, son," Elias bellowed, his voice barely audible over the tumult. He reached the branch just as the boy's grip began to slip, the wood cracking under the strain. With a grunt, Elias wrapped one arm around the boy's waist, hauling him free and onto his back. The child's weight a sudden anchor that nearly dragged them both under. The girl was next, and she was farther out, the current spinning her like a leaf in a whirlwind. Elias kicked hard, fighting the undertow that sucked at his feet, the boy's labored breathing hot against his neck. "Almost there, darlin'," he muttered through gritted teeth, though she couldn't hear him. A rogue wave crested over a rock and slammed into them, filling his mouth with brackish water, but he pressed on, his muscles screaming in protest. He lunged, fingers brushing her tunic, then grasping firm. She was lighter than the boy, but slippery as an eel, her body thrashing in panic. Elias clamped down, pulling her against his side with his free arm, the three of them now a tangled mass bobbing in the maelstrom. The river fought back fiercely, branches whipping past like lashes, rocks grazing his shins, drawing blood that clouded the water. His lungs burned, vision blurring from the strain, but he refused to let go. Inch by agonizing inch, he battled toward the shallows, where the bank rose like salvation, willows bending low as if to offer aid. Finally, his toes scraped gravel, and with the surge of adrenaline, Elias propelled them forward, collapsing onto the muddy shore in a heap of limbs and gasps. He rolled onto his back, chest heaving, the children sprawled beside him, their bodies racked with coughs as they expelled the river from their lungs. The boy retched violently, spewing water and bile, while the girl curled into a ball, her sobs raw and heartbreaking. Elias pushed himself up on elbows that trembled like aspen leaves, his own body aching from the cold and exertion. He shrugged off his sodden coat, a threadbare wool thing that had seen better days, and draped it over them both, pulling them close to share what little warmth he had. "Easy now, little ones," he murmured, his voice rough but kind, stroking the girl's tangled hair. "The river's done with you. You're safe on dry land." They looked up at him with eyes like polished obsidian, still wide with shock, but the terror ebbing as his words sank in. He assessed them quickly, and no broken bones, though the boy had a nasty gash on his forehead from the branch, and the girl's arm was bruised purple where the current had battered it against a rock. Elias tore a strip from his shirt to bind the wound, his rancher's hands surprisingly gentle. The children were Navajo, he guessed from their features and the intricate beadwork on their moccasins, though the river had stripped most of their adornments away. They shivered violently, teeth chattering, so he gathered them up one under each arm, surprisingly light despite the water weighing them down, and began the long trudge back to his cabin. It was nearly a mile through uneven terrain, the sun just peeking over the eastern rim, casting long shadows that danced like specters. Elias's bare feet blistered on the sharp stones, but he didn't complain, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other, murmuring nonsense to keep the children calm. "Ain't no bear gonna get us now. See that hawk up there? He's watching over, makin' sure we're alright." The cabin came into view as the sun climbed higher, its rays turning the dust to gold. Elias kicked the door open and deposited the children on his cot, piling blankets over them before stoking the hearth fire back to life. The flames crackled hungrily, devouring the dry mesquite he'd chopped the day before, and soon the room filled with a comforting warmth that chased the chill from their bones. He rummaged in his larder, a rough shelf of canned goods and dried provision set, and pulled out a pot for coffee, the last of his grounds yielding a thin, aromatic steam. While it brewed, He sliced bread from a loaf baked 2 days prior, now hard but edible when toasted, and portioned out jerky softened in hot water. The children watched him warily at first, huddled together like frightened rabbits, but hunger won out over fear. The boy spoke first, his English halting and accented, learned perhaps from the Mormon settlers to the north. "Thank you, white father. I am Tahoma. This my sister, Nizoni. River. Bad spirit today." Elias handed them tin mugs of the coffee, diluted with water to stretch it, and sat on the floor beside the cot, his wet clothes steaming in the heat. "No need for thanks, Tahoma. Name's Elias, and I'm no father to anyone these days, but you're welcome here as long as you need." Nizoni sipped tentatively, her eyes flicking to the door as if expecting pursuit, but she relaxed when Elias offered a smile, crooked and genuine. They were beautiful children, he thought. High cheekbones, skin like burnished copper, hair black as midnight even when matted. Tahoma explained in fragments how they'd been sent at first light to fill water gourds for the band's morning meal, the storm's fury catching them by surprise as the river rose like a vengeful ghost. Their village was hidden in a side canyon a few miles upstream, a temporary camp during the autumn migration for hunting and gathering pecan nuts. Elias nodded, asking no prying questions. He knew the Navajo were a proud people, wary of outsiders after years of broken promises from the government agents and clashes with settlers pushing ever westward. As the morning wore on, the sun streaming through the single window to paint patterns on the walls, Elias tended to them with the care of a man who'd once dreamed of a family. He hung their tunics by the fire to dry, the deerskin steaming and shrinking slightly, and fashioned new bindings from clean rags for their scrapes. Nizoni winced as he cleaned her arm with boiled water, but she didn't cry. Her small jaw set in determination. To distract her, Elias told story of the simple tales of the land he'd grown up on, back east before the war called him west. "Once there was a rancher much like me, with a herd of cattle that could outrun the wind. But one day, a great flood came, and he had to swim the whole river with a calf on his back." "Sound familiar?" Tahoma chuckled, the sound like music in the quiet cabin, and even Nizoni's lips curved in a shy smile. They shared more of their language with him, teaching him words for Riveratua and friend Shishia, laughing when he mangled the pronunciations. For a few hours, the cabin felt less empty, filled with the patter of young voices and the crackle of the fire, a brief respite from Elias's solitary existence. By midday, as the sun beat down mercilessly outside, turning the air to a shimmering haze, hoofbeats echoed in the distance. Cautious at first, then bolder. Elias tensed, peering through the window to see 3 riders approaching on lean Mustangs, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. Warriors, no doubt, painted with ochre streaks across their cheeks and foreheads, rifles slung across their backs and knives at their belts. The lead scout was a wiry man with a scar bisecting his nose, his eyes scanning the cabin like a hawk sighting prey. Elias stepped out onto the porch, hands visible and empty, his own rifle left inside as a gesture of peace. "Morning, friends," he called, his voice steady. "Your young ones are here, safe and sound. Come see for yourselves." The scouts dismounted fluidly, their moccasins whispering on the dust, and approached with measured steps, hands near their weapons. Inside, Tahoma and Nizoni lit up like stars, rushing to embrace the scarred warrior who proved to be their uncle. Joyful cries in Navajo filled the air, a torrent of relief and gratitude that needed no translation. The Unclique, as Elias later learned it, clasped his nephew and niece tightly, then turned to the rancher, his gaze appraising but softening. Through gestures and broken words, he conveyed their thanks, pressing into Elias's hands a finely woven blanket, its patterns of geometric thunderbirds a masterpiece of their craft, and pouches heavy with dried corn, beans, and squash of provisions that would sustain him through the lean months. "You safe," Kes said, thumping his chest. "We remember. More come soon. Hunt finish, bring horse, trade." Elias accepted the gifts with a nod, feeling the weight of their trust like a mantle. The children mounted behind the scouts on a spare pony, waving furiously as they rode off into the canyon's embrace, their laughter trailing like a melody. Elias watched until they were specks in the distance, then turned back to his chores, the blanket draped over his shoulders against the afternoon chill. The encounter lingered in his mind, a spark of warmth in the cold routine of survival. He mended defense with renewed vigor, the river now calm as if ashamed of its rage, and as evening fell, he cooked a meal from the gifted corn, the kernels popping sweetly in the pan. Night wrapped the land in silence, broken only by the hoot of an owl, and Elias lay on his cot, staring at the rafters, wondering if the world might hold more than endless toil. Sleep came deep and dreamless, the scent of peanut smoke lulling him into peace. But dawn, that treacherous hour when the world held its breath, brought thunder not from the sky, but from the earth. Hoofbeats, hundreds strong, rolled across the Badlands like an earthquake, shaking the cabin's walls and jolting Elias awake. He bolted upright, heart hammering, and snatched his sharp rifle from its peg above the mantel, the cold metal familiar in his grip. Not fear, exactly. Elias had faced down mercy but caution born of a lifetime on the edge. He cracked the door, peering into the pink street light, and what he saw stole his breath. A legion of riders, 100 Navajo warriors at least, astride ponies decked in feathers and bells, their bodies adorned with turquoise and silver that caught the first rays like stars fallen to earth. They formed a vast semicircle before his cabin, silent and imposing, lances upright and bows at rest, but the air thrummed with their presence, a force of nature harnessed. At their forefront rode the giant of a man, his horse a magnificent Appaloosa with spots like scattered embers. He was Haston, war chief of the band, his face a map of scars and wisdom, long hair braided with eagle feathers and bound by a headband of hammered silver. Tahoma and Nizoni rode flanks on smaller ponies, their eyes shining with excitement. Haston dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator, his moccasins soundless on the dew-kissed ground, and strode forward, the warriors parting like water. Elias stepped out fully, rifle barrel down but ready, his stance wide. "Chief," he said, voice level as the horizon, "if it's reckoning you seek, state it plain." "But no, I've no quarrel with you or yours." Haston halted a pace away, towering over Elias yet meeting his eyes with unflinching respect. The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken historiassa of land stolen, blood spilled, treaties inked on paper worth less than dust. But the chief raised a hand, palm out in the universal sign of peace, and his voice rumbled like distant thunder, deep and resonant in English honed by years of negotiation. "Reckoning? No, Elias Thorne, savior of my blood. You are no enemy this day. You are the hand of the river gods, pulling my children from the jaws of Tosahi, the water monster." He gestured sharply, and from the ranks, 2 elders advanced, leading a stallion of breathtaking beauty up its coat, a deep chestnut burnished to copper, muscles rippling under skin as smooth as silk, eyes intelligent and proud. Beside it, they bore stacks of pelts, a soft rabbit and supple deer fit for trade in any town, and a sacred bundle wrapped in buckskin, containing cornmeal blessed by the Hotai Alii, feathers from the thunderbird, and pollen for protection.